So this is just a quick guide as to how to use the verification control document. When you open the document, the first page will be the progressive plan tab. As previously discussed, this lists the requirement IDs as well as the requirement description. I've put in a little bit of random data in there just to show how it works. The first thing that needs to be done is that the requirement IDs and their respective descriptions need to be populated in the progressive plan. And the other area of information required is underneath the validation data. But we'll come on to that in a moment. So it's the contractor's responsibility to import all of the relevant requirement IDs and the respective descriptions. For the purpose of frequency mid, there is a column here for applicability, which relates to whether or not the requirement is, or rather I should say the verification activity is planned for either the RM only or both the final design and the RM. This sheet has been set up with drop downs and with some intelligence. If there's ever any uncertainty about the acronyms that are used in this sheet, that's found in the data validation tab, which lists a few of the definitions all of the definitions which are used in this sheet, as well as some of the validation and the drop-down selection options that are used in this sheet. As I say, for frequency mid only, there's a applicability column. So once the requirement IDs have been populated and the descriptions, we would then select the applicability. I've set this sheet up so that if a field is left blank, it appears in this green color. And once we start populating it, that will change. So let's take, for instance, we have a requirement which is applicable to both the final design and the RM. We would read this Excel sheet from left to right, and we've got these couplings of a definition of the type of product which is being verified, or that's either a design model, a prototype, engineering model, qualification model, or a flight model. Again, those definitions are under the validation data tab. As we're making this up, we're going to select that this is applicable to a qualification model. And the qualification model, the selection in this column specifically refers to which model is being verified underneath the SRR. We've got a similar coupling to the right, where we have the possibility of selecting a different kind of model. So let's say a flight model for the DDR. The columns, which are called out by the respective milestone, it's SRR, DDR, PRR, and then VAAs. These fields are used as part of the progressive verification planning activity. This allows us to track how verification methodologies evolve over the course of the project. We would expect the verification and the derived level of confidence to increase. The inverse of that is that we would expect technical risks to drop. So for the SRR, we're gonna select analysis. So in this instance, the best way to read this sheet as it stands is that for the SRR, analysis will be performed on a qualification model, which is applicable to both the final design and the RM. For the DDR, we may move to the flight model, and in this case, we might be looking to perform a test. So this planning sheet really just says, what's it applicable to, which model are we performing the verification on, and what is our planned approach at each milestone to progressively increase confidence and ultimately to de-risk technical risks. There is a slight difference when considering the AAs. At this point in time, we don't have a choice as to which model we'll be selecting. It's the flight model because we're at the point of production, installation, commissioning, and to a certain degree use of the telescope. So those milestones do not have a coupled column to sit with each milestone. Once this is fully populated, a lot of these green cells will turn various colors. There's a slight grading when considering the method of verification which is used, but it's best ignored. But there's a slightly sliding scale in terms of what gives you more confidence, what de-risks most heavily, with test being a very, very high weighting of de-risking, and with something such as analogy being relatively poor. However, it's very important to take note that commercial off-the-shelf equipment can be verified by analogy. This isn't this is bad and this is good kind of a scale. It's just a color coding. So once these fields are populated, the planning aspects of verification should be relatively well known. It should be in keeping with the verification plan, which should really set the qualitative information that supports the selections in these fields. We move into the other parts of this spreadsheet, where we're looking at each milestone individually, looking at the SRR, DDR, pre-production review, and then into the AAs. And we'll start with the SRR. All of these sheets, I should say, are basically identical. So I'll only run through one. But if we take the SRR, these fields for the requirement ID and the title will automatically populate once these fields in the progressive plan are populated. You can see if I put in 11 and a 12, as well as a description, 11 and 12. When we go into the SRR, we've now got 11 and 12 there populated. The design compliance is a free, or an empty field, I should say, for population by the contractor. There are several choices. Again, there's a grading here with compliance being obviously good, and non-compliance or an unknown being less favorable. For each requirement that we have here, we would expect a design compliance to be established and to be populated. The verification method is automatically pulled in from the progressive tab. So if I add, for instance, a couple of analyses on the end, then we can see that there's two analyses that have just pulled through. Similarly, the product, whichever product is selected within the progressive plan tab, this will reflect within this product list. So again, if we go and change the change that QM to an EM, and similarly an FM there, we should see that reflect in those fields there. The test status, or specifically the test case status here, again is a drop-down list. What we're assessing here is whether or not the test case has been run, whether it's in progress, whether it failed for whatever reason, or if it's being prevented from being performed. All of that information is useful to try to understand any kind of scheduling impacts, and the statement here is used to try to advance and progress the verification activities. Similarly, the test case result, so having performed or passed the test case, We're then looking to assess what the result of that test case was. So in this case, we could have a pass with errors, or a flat-out fail. So in this case, we'll select a pass. Again, this paints a very clear picture to us as to whether or not each requirement, well, the status of each requirement in terms of its compliance, as well as where the test case, or the status of the test cases and how they're being performed. Finally, we'll move on to the evidence fields. Now, this is a drop-down list which you'll notice is blank. Typically, the test result might be a data set or a results sheet, something which is very short and sharp, which effectively provides us with empirical data as well as a definition of what we would call acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria are the conditions by which we would deduce whether the empirical data constitutes a pass or a fail. So for instance, if the mass of a certain object needs to be less than 25 kilos, and we weigh that item and it comes in as 26, the acceptance criteria here is less than 25. The test case would be passed, but the test case result would be a fail. We need to have a little bit more information here in the case where we have a pass and something like a pass with errors or a flat-out pass. We would like to have a linking to that specific results sheet. And the way to do that is to head over to the data or the validation data tab. And in the bottom here, there's a TC evidence references. And what we'll do here is we'll put in test result sheet number 1. Well, let's call it that, but we'll call it TC001. It's revision 1, and we'll include a link to where that file can be located, whether it's a web link to somewhere on ALIM, or whether or not it's stored on a document management system or a cloud-based document management system such as Google Drive or SharePoint. It's just to make sure that it's accessible by the assessing team. If we head back to the SRR, in our drop-down, it should now say TC001. Now, whilst this test or this linking to this result sheet is beneficial for determining the validity of these previous two statements, what's very important here is that we also have a means by which the assessing person can deduce that the correct test was performed. And what I mean by that is that it's easy to measure the wrong thing. If you're doing an inspection that constitutes a measurement activity with something like a CMM, it's perfectly plausible that the wrong dimension could be measured. Usually the methodology by which the test is performed, what equipment is used, whether that equipment is up to calibration and has certificates to demonstrate that, all of that information should sit within either a methodology, a procedural document, or a protocol. And it is beneficial for us to have a link or an understanding as to where we can find that documentation. Again, linking through either a web URL or to a DMS. If that can be put in here within the comments, that would be wonderful. In the case of something like a non-compliance, this comment section should be used to provide some rationale or a justification. It's perfectly plausible that a requirement is ill-worded or needs to be modified. If that's the case, then this provides us with a method by which we can go back to the requirements, make the necessary changes following an ECP, and then reissue those requirements such that that requirement can be interpreted correctly and tested properly. So this is why that is particularly important. I will stress as well in the test case results, whether that's a single-sided sheet or whatever, it's really important that the acceptance criteria is provided and it's very, very clear. It's also important within the methodology or the test procedure document to clearly link the relationship between the acceptance criteria and the context of the requirement. This is especially important for the reviewers of this information to be able to clearly see this is how the requirement's worded, this is the data set or the characteristic that we're extracting by performing this test, and this acceptance criteria is clearly linked to this requirement. The smoother that kind of traceability can be, the easier this process will be. Once we've completed this spreadsheet, the SRR, that's to be submitted at the relevant milestone. Once we've done that, we can progress to the next milestone. The transition between, let's say, one milestone and the next is that there will be an expectation that compliance has rolled forward, in the sense that there has been progress that has been made, and that can be that progress could be, for instance, moving from the engineering model to the qualification model and performing the same test and still extracting a pass condition, or it could be a progression in terms of an analysis was performed at the SRR and then at the DDR, because a physical piece of hardware was received, a test was performed. Again, that's another logical way in which progression can be made. There may be some slight tweaks to this spreadsheet when the template is released, in the sense that there may be a cover page. Our expectations would be that the contractor clearly define the author of this document as well as the signatories on there. It will follow a standard SKO template for releasing Excel templates. The major thing is just to double check that all of the requirements are listed. That's also another small quality check. And where necessary, if there are clauses or requirements which are derived from ISO standards, international standards, or relevant national and state standards that apply, these can also be added in conjunction with the requirements which are pulled from JAMA. The intent behind this document is really to smoothen the assessment of compliance, and where necessary, make clear any blockers or obstacles which are otherwise preventing the verification activity moving forward. If there are any questions on the use of this sheet, feel free to drop me an email. I'll attach my email address onto the web link associated with where this file is contained, and that's it.